Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Elisabeth, for joining us online. So, today we're here to talk about some pretty serious topics. So what have the 2016 EU referendum, the 2016 presidential election, MH17, QAnon, the COVID-19 pandemic, and most recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine got in common? They're all examples of scenarios where information has been weaponized and malign influence has attempted to sow division within our society and mistrust. And they're also examples that have heightened public awareness of the complexities of 21st century living for today's citizen. Today we're here to talk about disinformation and also misinformation, and also the increasing convergence between more traditional digital threats such as cybersecurity. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed set of panelists. Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Collin Kelly, Applied Research Labs Lead at AI startup Adarga. And Jain, CEO and co-founder of Logically, a startup tackling disinformation and misinformation at scale. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Saj Huck, Chief Commercial Officer at Plexal, and we're delighted to welcome you to this episode of Cyberlates, our quarterly meetup. So, disinformation. Elisabeth, over to you first, I think. I mean, you study this area extensively. Can you just give us a bit of a frame of reference for what the types of things that you're seeing out there on this topic?
Yeah, so disinformation is the willful sharing of the willfully incorrect information, and misinformation is the accidentally incorrect information, and both are proliferating. And I think that the root of it is that there is no such thing as information literacy, an information literacy requirement in our society. So we all have the ability to generate information and to share information, but there is no requirement, and indeed no large-scale teaching of information literacy, which means that even the people who have good intentions when it comes to information often end up sharing incorrect information simply because they don't know how to verify information. So we've got the confluence of just lacking education of the general public. I mean, we need a driver's license to drive a car, but we don't need an information license to operate social media or indeed any other information-based system. So we've got the confluence of that combined with the desire by some hostile states and indeed by some groups within our own societies to cause panic, alarm, distrust, anxiety. And it's a very powerful combination that has succeeded in creating so much discord within our societies. And I'm not saying it used to be, our societies here in the West used to be happy, clappy and harmonious 20 years ago before the arrival of smartphones and indeed of social media, but at least they were somewhat more harmonious than they are now. And it's not just about harmony, it's about actual life and death issues, right? I mean, a number of people died at the storming of the Capitol, which was based on incorrect information, the incorrect information being that Donald Trump had been robbed of his election victory. That was obviously not correct information. And we have seen violence against workers or volunteers for that matter at COVID vaccination sites, again based on the incorrect information that COVID is not real. So it's not just sort of a nicety that we should concern ourselves about. It really is a corrosive issue in our liberal democracies. And my biggest concern is that there is no tool available at the moment for the general public, including every single one of us in your room and around us, for us all to educate ourselves and keep ourselves updated about misinformation, disinformation, trends and to be information literate. It really is incredible that we can exist in this environment without having the tools to verify information, because that exacerbates an already bad situation.
Yeah, thank you, Elisabeth. I think you set the framework really well. I just wanted to go over to you, Lyric. I mean, can you just give us a sense of how big this problem is and how you landed on trying to address it?
I'll start with a bit of my attempt at comedy. As one of the biggest agents of disinformation says, it's huge. Hey, he tried. He's not just a boring tech founder. No, it is incredibly large, and it's growing. The scale of operations that we see today in the wild dwarf what we saw in 2016. But it's not just that, it's getting more complex. Back in the day, all we used to talk about is, oh yeah, these campaigns, they exist on Facebook, on Twitter. They're everywhere now. I think one of the largest operations we worked on, I think it was across 80-something platforms. Wow. And increasingly, it's going into private areas, it's going into even dating sites. I'm not talking about mis and disinformation in the sense of people having fake and catfishing profiles, but in a nation-state sense, like literally nation-states trying to compromise very specific people in countries by using typical tactics of kind of fake persona accounts and fake narratives that they think people would find interesting. So the problem really has grown, and all we need to look at is how harms that have been caused by mis and disinformation have grown over time. Way back in the day, so even say 5-6 years ago, if you thought, we used to think of these people, kind of conspiracy theorists and people who believe in disinformation, as kind of children who are sitting in their mum's basements, and who are they really hurting? Well, we know, now we know. In the early days of the pandemic, multiple 5G towers in the UK and across Europe were burned down as a result of people believing that 5G causes COVID, which it obviously doesn't. Again, this is completely ridiculous stuff, like not just stuff that you would think people could realistically believe or is in the gray area where maybe there is some room for argument. This is completely out there stuff. The QAnon conspiracies, again, wildly different foundations to anything that most people would assume is something that's grounded in reality, and it resulted in people storming what's supposed to be the most secure building in the world. Or one of them, at least. So I think the problem is growing at an alarming rate, but what we're seeing is the harms caused by the problem are growing at an increasingly larger rate. And it doesn't just impact kind of the general public. It impacts governments from a public health, public safety, elections, national security point of view. It impacts platforms because, again, ultimately, in some countries, liability for doing something about it rests with them. In other countries, they have some protections. It affects all of us as individuals. It's starting to impact businesses. So I think the kind of vulnerability surface in cybersecurity terms, if you like, if where disinformation is having an impact, is growing quite alarmingly.
It's really interesting you touched on whose responsibility is it. We'll come back to that in a second. I just wanted to go over to you, Collin, and really explore how Adarga landed on addressing this problem, because obviously you've got a much greater focus on broader data challenges.
Yeah, so I think if we're talking about today, so far we've talked about the disinformation problem, and I guess we are trying to tackle the information problem, which is one of, we all have so much data coming through, we need to process it. I guess one of our primary use cases is for kind of an intelligence analyst who's got a load of open source information, maybe they've got some internal intelligence documents which they need to kind of overlay into that, and we're really trying to use natural language processing, which is my area of expertise, to really explore that, synthesize it, summarize it, and draw out, I guess, just really inferences from the data that they've pulled in. And I guess the relationship to disinformation is around the fact that we as a, we are aware of this problem around disinformation. It's a perennial question when we speak to our customers. They say, well, what about disinformation? And the thing is, right now, in terms of technical capability, I don't think it's there. We just don't. It is impossible to kind of map, to tell whether or not, just based on the sentence alone and so on, whether or not a sentence or a statement or a paragraph is true. You can try and there's moves, I guess, in the AI community to kind of bring in multimodality, pull out relationships with what's actually going on in the real world, but it's still very early days. So therefore, we aim to kind of elevate the human in the context of this, so allow our users to make the decision for themselves. So if they're pulling in a number of data sources, one thing oftentimes they'll say, oh no, we don't want to bring in, that propaganda source because it's going to pollute the data set that we've got. And actually, our preference is to, tell our users to be able to tell them to label it, oh, I'm skeptical of this source, and then use the capability we've got to kind of say, oh, is, Russia Today, are they reporting on something which is aligned with actually what Western media is saying, or is it maybe misaligned? And kind of like really allowing the user to understand those differences is kind of informative in and of itself. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting, I guess, research area as well. How can you solve disinformation from a technical point of view? But for now, we're kind of just assisting users to try and pull it out and distinguish it from regular information themselves.
That's really interesting. Elisabeth, for you, Lyric already touched on this, but briefly around responsibility. And you've already said, how can it be in today's society that we don't have the right tools or the training or the awareness to really understand what the information that's being put in front of us. Whose responsibility do you think this is to solve?
So in a previous life, I was a journalist, and for 5 years of that life, I was a technology correspondent based in San Francisco, which meant visiting lots of startups all the time. This was between 2004 and 2009. So I visited Facebook when it was new, but I also visited, lots and lots of companies, most of which, of course, didn't survive. That's the nature of startups. But I remember visiting one company, and so the way it worked with this company as with other companies is you went to the website and you clicked on contact us, and it was info@blah.com. And so you emailed and somebody responded. And in this case, it was one of the co-founders that responded. It was usually the case because it was usually with startups, it's just a few guys, right? So this guy responded, and one of the co-founders and I went to visit, and it was 10 guys in a sort of a warehouse south of Market in San Francisco. Just the usual startup setup with computers, desks, and a football table. And I remember this company, I thought, what is really the business model? It just doesn't work. I don't see why anybody would want to use this service. And that was Twitter. And so that is to say that Twitter didn't set out to rule the world of political discourse. They just happened into it, right? It was some idea that these 4 guys had, but they didn't set out to become a sort of a dominant political player, nor did Facebook, I think, but yet they are in this position today, and they, as a result, have a responsibility, and they have a responsibility to keep their platforms as clean as possible, and that's what legislators have been pleading with them to do. But it's clearly not working because the incorrect information continues to proliferate, even though they have these and other platforms have implemented some measures and to police it. And the problem, of course, is that as soon as you start policing, or I should say regulating what's on a website, then some people will say, you are silencing me. And unfortunately, the societal debate in most Western countries, especially in the US, is such today that even if the information that you're taking down is incorrect, some people will say that they are being silenced. And it's such a toxic situation that we are in. Nevertheless, I think they have to continue doing so, and they have to get better at it. But on top of that, I think, we clearly need information resilience training for citizens. And I realize I'm too optimistic saying that we should have something like a driver's license for information. But I do think that public libraries, for example, would be the perfect place, the perfect institution to offer information literacy training. And I think many of us would attend such training, both because we want to be information literate and we want to be good citizens. We don't want to willfully share falsehoods, and also because it sort of qualifies you, for example, it's a good entry on your CV, for example. I think future employers will look at whether you are information literate before hiring you, because companies can't afford to have people who are not information literate. So that's the second thing that can be done, and I think there's an enormous opportunity there for public libraries. Then a third thing is something that Sweden has done, which has set up a psychological defense agency staffed not by political appointees but by civil servants who are experts in disinformation and misinformation, influence campaigns, and preparedness. And so what you've got in Sweden is a bunch of specially trained police officers in this new government agency, along with people who previously worked at the Civil Contingencies Agency. I've known several of them for a long time. I have no idea which party they vote for, and that's as it should be, because this is not a political issue. It's a matter of keeping our information environment clean. And there, the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency's brief is to combat disinformation or malign influence coming from other countries. So they are not in charge of misinformation, disinformation that's generated within the country's borders. So it's sort of a partial area of responsibility, but I think it's a good start, because the moment you start trying to regulate and clean up information generated within the country, it just becomes so toxic that I think it's a no-win at the moment. But it's a much better model than the one that the US government tried a few months ago, where they set up a sort of a board staffed by political appointees with very clear political preferences, who were going to monitor and look after, identify all manner of disinformation, misinformation. And if it becomes a politically influenced tool, then you're doomed.
Yeah, really good perspectives. I think one of the things that I've been quite taken by, and I think a lot of people were quite taken by towards the end of 2021, was the declassification of intelligence by obviously non-partisan government agencies, mainly to, I guess, debunk false flag kind of and preemptive information campaigns in the run-up, obviously, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, the Swedish example, I think, is really eminent, actually, in terms of what government agencies can actually do as well. And I think the non-partisan...
And can I...
Yes, Elisabeth,
Can I give you a good example of something, of a disinformation or malign influence campaign that they detected and defanged early on? It's a really good example, I think. So it was earlier this year. So they were set up in January this year, and this malign influence campaign or they noticed it in the spring. So it was various accounts outside Sweden associated with sort of extremist Islamism that started spreading rumors that Muslim children were being kidnapped by Swedish social services. And these malign rumors spread far and wide in Sweden, and inevitably Muslim parents started getting concerned about, will they kidnap my children? And it was completely baseless. Such a thing doesn't happen in Sweden, but it was such a potent allegation to make that it started spreading very quickly, and people started protesting in front of various municipal agencies and so forth. But before it got really serious, this Psychological Defense Agency noticed it, and the government launched a sort of a public awareness campaign, or it communicated to the public that this was completely false, so yes, the rumors still managed to spread in the first place, but it didn't get to a really serious stage, which I think is a good example of what can be done. We can't prevent malign influence, but we can limit its reach, and as a result, its harm.
And Lyric, obviously, with the work that you and the team at Logically do, you obviously see quite a lot of what's happening out there. I mean, what else can be done, or how is industry tackling this problem?
I think it's kind of well recognized that when we started at the journey, when kind of mis and disinformation as a problem started becoming more prominent, at least in the public's attention, pretty much every organization in the space was way too slow to move. I think what we're seeing over the last couple of years is examples of some successes, but there's a lot left to do. So maybe just dwelling on some of the successes for a moment, because when talking about disinformation, it's very easy to go into doom and gloom, but I think there are kind of positive stories to tell as well in terms of things that are impactful that are working. I think there's kind of capacity building projects that so many have undertaken, like the number of fact checkers in the world in 2016, I think it's nearly like 10x over the last 5 years, which is great. Again, fact checking, really good, really powerful in certain circumstances, but has limitations. Same applies to media literacy, for instance. There's this great app, I think it was Swedish, but it was sponsored out of kind of Professor Sander in Cambridge, called the Bad News Project, really aimed at gamifying the creation of disinformation campaigns as a way of like producing resilience. Like some of our own work when it comes to elections in the Indian context. Like pre-logically, folks identify the Election Commission of India, 900 examples of mis and disinformation, apolitical mis and disinformation over a whole national election cycle. 6 months later, we identified 30,000 in a state alone. So those are examples where I think progress is being made. But I think one of the areas where we're struggling as a space and more is required is really pairing up what we call kind of intelligence with countermeasures. So like intelligence problem is, okay, how do you at speed, scale, as precisely, accurately as possible, identify all the harmful stuff that's out there that is mis and disinformation? And then there's the problem of, okay, what do we do about it now? Because I think the commonly held perception by perhaps people who are not in the space is, oh yeah, let's just take it all down. That does not work. That, in a lot of cases, data showing it makes the problem worse. So I think it's figuring out what do effective and proportionate responses look like. And yes, sometimes it's takedowns. Sometimes it's escalating to law enforcement, as we did in days of the attacks on the vaccine centers. Like, I don't know how many we helped prevent. So each of these kind of countermeasures need baking in. A reset needs to be done on which ones work in which context to really come up with a model where we have this fast-moving intelligence that we can rely on in identifying these things at speed and scale and pairing it up with effective but proportionate countermeasures, because the proportionate word there is really important, because we could very quickly end up in censorship and Ministry of Truth territory. So I think that's the, again, there's a lot of unsolved problems, but for me, the most impactful unsolved problem right now would probably be focusing on that countermeasures piece, because, and I think we're quite far away from a solution there.
Yeah, so a lot of our work is in the startup ecosystem, and often we come across startups that are talking about AI, and I guess the assumption is just throw AI at this and it will solve everything. But I mean, clearly AI relies on good quality data. Collin, can you just touch on some of the problems that disinformation can actually cause for AI models?
Yeah, so it's we all know the phrase garbage in, garbage out, and if you've trained your model, so the latest and greatest in natural language processing at the moment is using large language models, and they are incredibly performant. They are almost terrifying in their apparent intelligence when you interact with them, but they have been trained on vast swathes of internet data, and no one's reviewed it. It's just, there's so much of it that even a team spending, it would be many, many months, I think, of effort to actually manually review all this information, which has been pulled into this model, and and it's being sold as an API, and you're able to, as I said, interact with it, and it will have consumed biases. It will also have consumed potentially personal information. There's again research in the areas about how do we kind of undo this, people's credit card details. If you ask GPT-3, if you ask it the right prompt, then it could potentially give you like personally identifiable information. And so we're at a really interesting point, I think, in terms of the technology is moving so far forward and quickly with the data that we're pulling in, that it's the results are almost so impressive, it's really easy to ignore the kind of potential concerns that you have with that. But I think we just really need to be alive to those concerns. So we have a responsible AI committee at Adarga, which I chair, and basically we are continuously thinking about how do we make sure that we're applying, I guess, our principles. We have a set of AI principles which we developed, and making sure we're applying them in what we do. But again, it's really tricky because, you know, we're all familiar with open source software. You're using other people's, you know, tooling, and similarly with these large models, if you're using the data that they've consumed, you don't necessarily have full access. So it's a really tricky problem to solve. So yeah, I don't have any easy answers though to that data problem, because the thing is, we all know that the more data you've got, probably the better your model will be, and so therefore it is a bit of a race to who can get the most data. And yeah, I'm not sure who's going to counteract that race with the concerns.
And it's okay, Collin, because we're not going to solve everything today. But I wanted to give the opportunity to somebody or people in the audience to ask a question. Has anyone got a hand over here? Stephen, we've got a mic inbound, just so Elisabeth can hear.
Yeah, given that you've identified that probably our biggest concern in disinformation is from hostile nation states, in particular Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and a lot of that disinformation comes not in English. What are you seeing that is being done to combat disinformation on a cross-language basis that is not English? Because it seems to me, in order for us to identify trends, we need to focus on other languages other than English.
Was that for a specific panelist?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess if Lyric logically has any ideas, but for either of them.
Sure. It's complex, obviously. I think the way we describe it is there's probably 3 sets of complexities that needs to be unlocked before any disinformation solution can come anywhere near being universal. Yes, it's got to be multilingual, it's got to be multimodal, and it's got to be cross-platform. So the multilingual problem is a tricky one because really the state of NLP in various languages is in very different states. So in a lot of our work, like we've got near English levels of performance, or maybe even greater in some cases, when it comes to Mandarin. Some of the major European families are behind that, but fairly behind that. And the rest of the world, it's in a completely different league when it comes to, well, maybe Arabic's an exception, but like all the other individual kind of country-specific languages or language families are in a very different place. I think we've experimented with everything from kind of cross-lingual embeddings and really something that scales horizontally across global family of languages. We've not seen really promising results from. I think the only thing that's come close is having some kind of cross-lingual capability focused on families of languages where where the state of NLP is in a better place. Or outside of that, you get near translation level performance in every other language. So translate and then apply an English model versus apply a language-specific NLP model reasonably the same order of magnitude. The exception, I'd say here, and potentially the silver lining here, is not all disinformation and not all misdetection requires you to know what the text is. And maybe this is the logically point of view, so it may be controversial, but fundamentally we don't believe you need to know whether something is true or not when it comes to disinformation. When it's misinformation, you do. That's the definition. When it comes to disinformation, our view is if it's more to do with the methods that are used as opposed to the content itself. And that doesn't require that much dependency on translation. So do you really need a language model to tell you if something is inauthentic or not? It helps. It's a really helpful set of signals, but it doesn't. You can do without it. So that's the way in which we work around kind of ensuring some of our tech works multilingually. But yeah, if someone's got a solution to cracking multilingual, that's a $1 billion idea in itself.
Elisabeth, did you have anything to add to what Lyric just said?
No, just to say that he made excellent points, and especially about the difference between misinformation, disinformation in the way you detect it. Yeah, really, absolutely agree with your points.
Brilliant. We've got a couple more questions. We've got one over here.
As a follow-on to that.
Okay, yep.
Just as a follow-on to that, I'm John Brewer. I'm working with the Disarm Foundation, so that's it was Amit. I don't know if there's any raise hands if anyone's heard of Amit. Be quite interesting. Thank you, Lurie. So it's basically taken the MITRE ATT&CK framework from cybersecurity and sort of repurposing it for disinformation. So it's looking at tactics, techniques, and procedures. So you can see the red things coming at you, and then there's a blue framework of counter measures that you can apply to those red attacks. Anyway, just the point about the language thing. Obviously, you've got analysts working in different languages across different regions, creating reports. We're able through, in the same way that MITRE ATT&CK tags reports with MITRE TTP tags, we can do the same thing with disinformation TTPs, and those TTPs are numerically coded. So when our founder SJ Terp last year was doing some work, counter anti-vax work for WHO in Europe, she was working cross-language, but she was able to, because once everyone's in the different languages done that initial translation and actually married up the numbers, then those TTPs are automatically understood by everybody.
Interesting. Any other? I think Bruno, you've got one.
Thank you. Bruno Susat, part of the Plexal team. Thank you for that. I thought it was really interesting. Given the uncertainty of the future of the online harms bill and when that's all going to happen, do we think that there is now a provision or an opportunity to maybe include mis or disinformation within that legislation? And if so, how do we go about doing that?
Any takers? I should say Elisabeth had to leave. Unfortunately, she's got another event to go to. But
I'll take a crack at it. By no means a policy expert, but I think it's highly likely something's going to happen with the online safety bill. If it's not the online safety bill, something will happen with the DSA that's going through in Europe. I believe in the initial drafts, mis and dis are out there when it comes to priority harms. But I think any dilution of the bill, what's likely is countries will still want to retain protections around how mis and dis from outside of a country's own borders are impacting things domestically or their interests abroad. So I think that element is low-hanging fruit, completely apolitical, and most countries would have a vested interest in certainly pursuing that. But I do agree, kind of looking at it more domestically in the UK and in America with First Amendment protections and Section 230, etc., is quite complex. But the way we see it, regulations, again, companies usually look at regulations like, oh no, regulations. The way we see it, oh yeah, regulations. And it's one that we feel is going to be an inflection point for the disinformation, misinformation as a space, or even online safety in general as a space. Like we've seen like M&A activity by major platforms in the lead up to, not major platforms like some of the mid-tier ones. I hate to say it, Yahoo News, probably a mid-tier one these days. They've acquired a company that does credibility assessments, and that's partly to meet some of these compliance needs that are coming in. So I think as a space, it'll get more exciting in terms of timings of specific bills and what the scope in it is. That's politics, I guess.
Great, cheers. Just over here.
Hi, James Say from Deinter. So the rhetoric seems to generally be that the West is like a victim of misinformation. I wonder if you've done any research or any work around actually combating disinformation that originates from the West, or is that kind of, do we not really care about that? Is that sort of...
So not specifically that question, however, we've recently embarked on a kind of narratives project, which is around basically developing tooling to try to kind of do the next level of what I described earlier, which is kind of understanding different perspectives. So using NLP to kind of track how different sources are reporting events, and you know the sequence of events, the entities that are involved in those events, and kind of like laying those out so that you can see different perspectives. And the advantage of this method is that you can basically filter on whoever you want, and you can kind of cluster well, the idea is that we cluster kind of based on, you know, oh, these events are similar, or this set of circumstances all relates to the same thing. And the idea is if you can lay that out, and then filter based on maybe it's, you know, oh, what does the US think versus, or what are US sources saying versus what is, or British sources saying, you might be able to, again, you know, distinguish between those. It doesn't get to the, going back to my earlier point, doesn't get to the disinformation part, but I actually think that that's almost as interesting, because you could argue, you know, the US and the UK are unlikely to push disinformation, he says. However, they absolutely have an agenda, and they will push that agenda, and I don't think that's controversial to say. And so I think that being able to visualize that is a useful thing.
I think you handled that tricky question very well, so we should move on. Probably time for two last questions. So I think we've got one over there.
Sorry, I'm terrible with microphones. So I suppose I was wondering whose job you think it is to say what is misinformation. I mean, you look at dieting advice and they all say different things. How do you know what is right and what isn't right, and whose job it is to do that? Because I can imagine it'd be very dangerous if government turn around and go, well, that's right, that's wrong, and yeah.
I'll take this one. I don't think I think there's many wrong answers to that. I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. I can share some context in terms of how some of that decision-making works today, and some of the limitations of it. At the moment, when most platforms make decisions when it comes to misinformation in particular, not all the other harms, not hate and child safety and all of that, those other harms, a lot of them take care of in-house or outsource it to kind of random companies that are out there. No offense, random companies. But when it comes to mis and disinformation, or misinformation in particular, there is a sensitivity involved. And at the moment, most platforms rely on a very small community of IFCN accredited fact-checking organizations in the world, of which we're one. Really, again, what we don't want in that situation is for that to be the ministry of truth. So sometimes fact-checkers come up with contradictory answers. Really, for us, fact-checking, which is more of a misinformation problem than a disinformation problem, is a process. It's a process where kind of the individuals and the systems that are doing it are experts at a process, not necessarily experts in that topic. So that's one of the ways in which kind of bias, et cetera, can be eliminated from things like fact-checking. And we feel it's reasonably resilient to kind of being influenced by people, et cetera. I think long-term what we're looking at is maybe a blown-up version of that. Say if the online safety bill goes through in something like its current iteration, Ofcom won't be making that decision in the UK. It'll be third parties. It'll be kind of civil society organizations, private sector organizations that will be responsible for making individual assessments. And one of the ways in which I think about it, it's not a perfect example, is what we need is something similar to an S&P or a Moody's, like what they do for financial instruments in terms of rating the risk in them, but for mis and disinformation. So that's kind of how we'd like to position ourselves for the future, where we're not the only input. This is, in startup land, this is not a winner-take-all problem, but it's one where multiple organizations are contributing, coming up with ratings, and different organizations may choose to make different decisions as a basis of all of those assessments.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions? I could just see... Okay, Sam, I think you've got a question. I think it's a bit of a cheat when Plexal people ask.
Cheers, Saj. So there's an internet adage called Brandolini's law, which basically states that humans will always be at a disadvantage in combating mis and disinformation because the amount of time taken to refute misinformation is an order of magnitude greater than the amount of time taken to create it. With that in mind, and that humans may always be at a disadvantage in combating misinformation, do you think that it is a problem that can ever be solved?
I mean, Collin, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I can. So, obviously I'm going to fly the Adarga flag one more time. I guess platforms like ours are designed to help you with that kind of problem. I think but it is a really interesting problem because I think it's not just a technical, both a technical solution, you can have software which helps you get to the truth faster, but I think there's also the kind of, sociological, whatever you want to call it, the human element to that. A little bit to what Elisabeth was saying earlier about training and making sure that we have, switched on citizens when it comes to this. And I really do think it's actually that the teaming of critically minded citizens, plus I do think technology can help actually get to the bottom of some of these questions. So yeah, I think, it's a little bit, it's again the race, the good guys and the bad guys. Like, can the good guys keep up, and can we actually build the tools to help us solve some of those problems? And I think we can, optimistically.
Lyric?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that, right? I think if you look at it 4 or 5 years ago, we were fighting an asymmetric problem. The guys on the other side of the table had technology. The guys on this side of the table didn't. And now they're starting to. And we've got to keep the rate of innovation and technology higher on this side than the other side. So it's almost an old school kind of arms race problem. And in some ways, this is where red teaming and also working on those adversarial technologies helps. Again, it needs loads of protection, safeguards to be able to do that. Again, this might be a PR crisis waiting to happen for us, but we've built models that generate kind of based on synthetic text generation that create mis and disinformation. Again, we didn't put it out there, any recordings that are happening, but purely to retrain and identify various generations of models as being models that, it's a signature for us. It's like, okay, this generation of synthetic text generation creates this kind of signatures when you try and run detection models on it. So it's like artificial GAN problem. So it's, yeah, I think I'd probably flip the question the other way around, which means kind of now that we know and technology is being used on the other side of the table and used increasingly, we have no choice but to use technology on this side of the table if we have a chance in hell of keeping up.
Brilliant, thank you. Lyric, Collin and Elisabeth, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for your questions and engagement in today's Cyber Late. So that brings this quarterly session to a close. There was just a couple of things I just wanted to mention before we break for food and drinks, which are just out in the park. So a lot of our work obviously involves working with novel technologies and really interesting and disruptive startups. And last week we welcomed 36 startups to our Cyber Runway program and 5 startups to our NCSC for Startups program, many of whom are in the room today. Please do engage with those businesses. They're doing some really interesting things, tackling some pretty serious and strategic problems. Do also check out our website, www.plexal.com. And if you are interested in engaging with our community, our ecosystem, and also the topics such as disinformation, cybersecurity, the convergence of emerging technologies and national security, do drop us a line at connect@plexal.com. The next Cyber Lates is on 6th of December, and we'll be looking ahead to the opportunities and challenges for the 2023 cyber security landscape. I just wanted to say as well a massive thank you to our partners, Tech London Advocates and TLA Cyber, for supporting this event and also supporting our ecosystem as well. So Russ Shaw is here in the room. Do speak to him if you're interested in getting involved in Tech London Advocates, a really, really influential movement that's representing UK tech. Thank you all, and enjoy the food and drinks afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.